Welcome everyone to my Zoom space. My name is Josephine Withers and I'm delighted to be with you today. This is a two-part series. What is feminist art? And then what is a feminist perspective? Those will be in two parts. The mysteries revealed. For those of you who may not know me or have not been in my space before, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Josephine Withers, and I've been living in Oakland, California since 2013. Before that, I lived in Maryland, and my career path was as an art historian teaching at the University of Maryland in College Park. My specialty was in contemporary and modern art history, both European and American, and also with a focus on feminism, feminist art, feminist theory. So I'm delighted to share with you today some of my thoughts on how that came about in this country and how we can all develop a feminist perspective, no matter who we are, and whether we're looking at art specifically or looking out at our culture and the world. So let's get started. Before there was actually a movement that we could call feminist art, there were some rumblings going on in the background. And one of the earliest ones was the author Betty Friedan. For those of you of a certain age like myself, you probably remember The Feminine Mystique, which she published in 1963. And I'm showing you here a quote that really summarizes where she was going in The Feminine Mystique. She wrote, "The problem lay buried, unspoken. For many years in the minds of American women, it was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning, that is, a longing that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban housewife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds and shopped for groceries, she was afraid to even ask herself the silent question, is this all? Another voice that came to prominence around this time was Linda Nochlin, who is an art historian. At that time, she was teaching at college, Vassar College, which of course was a women's college at that time. And she published this bombshell in Art News, which is a widely distributed art magazine, back in 1971, with the provocative question, why have there been no great women artists? And of course, behind that provocative question was a desire on her part to disprove that there indeed had been great women artists. However, she did have some caveats. What she pointed out was that, and she was talking about going all the way back to the Italian Renaissance and the 15th and 16th centuries and so forth, uh, and pointing out that even a woman with great talent and the desire to be an artist, she had almost no support whatsoever, either in the culture, in the art institutions of the time. She was not allowed to study in the art academies, which was really the main route to any kind of professional career. And the very few women who did manage to persevere were most likely taught by their fathers. So they kind of short circuited the official kind of training and support that came through the academies. And then, of course, even if she did succeed and got her work out there and appreciated, guess who got to write up the art history. Usually they were white male writers and other artists who wrote the history. And so very often women, even that had some celebrity in their time, were very often written right out of history. So that's part of the thesis that Linda Nochlin was suggesting in this article. Now, another voice that emerged at this time too, in the late 60s and into the 70s, was Lucy Lippard, who was not an artist. She is an art writer, art critic, great supporter of women artists and feminist artists. And in 1980, she stated that feminist art was neither a style nor a movement, but instead it's a value system, a revolutionary strategy, a way of life. So that's very important to keep in mind, because as we look at feminist art, we'll find that it doesn't have a particular style or look associated with it, because it really has to do with heartfelt values of really bringing women and women's art to the forefront. And with that, a better understanding of women's experiences as portrayed through the arts. Now, one of the early displays that was explicitly feminist was a group project called Woman House. And there may be some people in our audience that actually remember this from 1972, which of course was in Los Angeles, as you can see here. And the story behind it is that Judy Chicago, who I'll talk about later, and Miriam Shapiro both taught in a program which they created, the Feminist Art program in Los Angeles. And it was at that point part of California Cal Arts, as it's known. And so what they set out to do in this feminist art program, they managed to get a hold of this mansion in Los Angeles that was about to be destroyed and something else built there. And so they got it free for a few months before it was torn down. And so what they did was to create the old style of what the kind of life that Betty Friedan was describing in her 1963 book. So you see here two shots where you see the bride in all her glory in a beautiful dress and the decor coming down the stairway and so forth. And at the bottom of the stairs, if you turn to your left or on our right in the picture, this is what you would see, the same bride imprisoned in a little linen closet, and by extension, of course, taking care of everything in the house. And there were many, many people, all the students participated in decorating the house. And there were also performance arts, performances and so forth. This is a separate piece made for Woman House by Miriam Shapiro, her very own dollhouse, which she has refashioned, so to speak, into a place that would be comfortable for a woman artist. And I'm showing you a detail on the lower right that you see here in the attic here of the artist studio. So it's kind of a reversal, you know, of the traditional woman posing as a model for the male artist. So she flipped it around and created this male nude. However, he's not the one that's being depicted. Instead, she shows a little miniature of the kind of painting that she was doing at that time, this kind of abstract windows. And if you're wondering what you see through the garret window in the center, it's a suggestion of where her roots came from, which is old Russia with its very recognizable architecture. This is just one of many performances that took place in Woman House. And the title of it was Cock Cunt. And so these women were in black leotards, and one obviously had a very large cock, and the other had a very large pink pussy. And so the dialogue, you can almost tell from their body language, goes back and forth, where the male, the cock, speaks in this very deep voice, demanding his attention, demanding his reward of sticking it into his lady friend here. And you can tell from her body language that she's talking in a very squeaky little voice, and wondering, what are you going to do with me? Like that. So that was one of the more hilarious performance pieces that took place during the few weeks that the house was open. Woman House was open to the public after the interiors had been completed. So here we have Linda Nochlin again. Remember, she's teaching at Vassar College. And this was probably this hilarious photograph was probably done sometime after her 1971 Art News article, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, where she is really like Miriam Shapiro was doing with her dollhouse male model. She's taking probably the hairiest model from the art class at Vassar and turning it on its head. And you can see that the bananas are very nicely poised at ground zero there. Buy some bananas. So of course it's a great spoof that has been widely circulated on the internet. So yet another one of the events that really marked the gradual opening, not so gradual opening, of feminist art and feminist artists was the National Conference of Women in the Visual Arts, which took place at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., 1972. And I was part of the organizing committee. And it's important to point out that it was not at all sponsored by the Corcoran Gallery of Art. They had nothing to do with it. It came about because we were able to shame them into giving us space in the art school, because the Corcoran is both a gallery, a museum, as well as an art school. And we were able to shame them into giving us space because they had never occurred to them to include women artists in any of their biennial exhibitions. So now I've organized the slides that we're going to be looking at into 4 different sections, which of course overlap in many cases. Claiming our bodies so that they're no longer belong to the males of the species. And then I want to talk about how many women artists brought crafts back into the realm of high art. And then a section on resisting the status quo, that is to say, the patriarchy. And then finally, rewriting art history. So first of all, claiming our bodies. Well, there would not be anything as spectacular as claiming your bodies as the performance work that Carolee Schneemann did with one of her performances from the 1960s, actually, called Interior Scroll. And the whole point of this performance, which was obviously both intended to kind of surprise and shock, of showing herself completely nude. And what she is doing is she's pulling her story, particularly in the right screen, she's pulling her story out of her vagina as a metaphor for how women see themselves as creating from the center, not necessarily specifically from the vagina, although many women, including Judy Chicago, would say that it is our sexuality which is involved in our creative activity. And so all of that was suggested in this remarkable performance, which Carolee Schneemann did many times, both here as well as in Europe. How better to claim your own body than the work of Eleanor Antin, also a performance work. So you see her here in the single photograph on the left, not trying to glamorize herself or to uplift her bosom, which is so typical of the way male artists represent women. She's showing herself in the nude, naked, and she's used a very wry kind of title, traditional sculpture. So what she did, the premise was that she wanted to lose 10 pounds. And so she went about this over the period of a month back in 1972. And so each day she took 4 photographs of herself, and you see a glimpse of that in the photo on the right, front, both sides, and rear. And of course, traditional sculpture, referring to how particularly a person, an artist, creating something out of clay or stone, they carve away, they subtract from the surface. And so she was taking away and sculpting away her own body. And so that again has a humorous side to it, like Linda Nochlin sort of made a pot shot of the patriarchy with her humor by some bananas. Judy Chicago also began really manifesting her specifically feminist art in the 1970s. And before she came to CalArts and the Woman House, she started doing these through the flower paintings. And it's also a suggestion of the idea of the center of the female body being the reproductive organs, that sort of gut, the lower chakras. And this is, of course, very abstracted, but it's a very powerful painting in the sense that it really draws you into the center, which is represented not as a thing or an image, but rather a kind of somewhat mysterious kind of pulsating center. She was to use this image through many different variations over the years, culminating in the dinner party, which we will talk about a little bit later. Now, Faith Ringgold did another variation on this traditional sculpture that Eleanor Antin did in the 70s. And Faith Ringgold, this is from the 1980s. This is what you're looking at here are photographs of herself documenting, as Eleanor Antin did, documenting her 100-pound weight loss, not just 10 pounds. And as an African-American woman, you can see that this is what the new Faith Ringgold that you see in the center, surrounded by photographs from earlier parts of her life where she's quite plump. And Faith Ringgold, as some of you may know, went on to create what she called story quilts. And we'll have more to say about her quilt work when we talk about crafts. But here she's incorporated that image, that part of the quilt that you see in a much larger, what she called story quilts. And this is different parts of the stories of her life. And you can see, if we could read it, you could see that it's written out. I mean, it's really a book in the form of a quilt, which itself, of course, is traditionally associated with women and women's work. And she calls these story quilts. So the idea is to have not just an image, but a whole narrative, a whole story that goes with it. Now, another kind of taboo image in Western art anyway is the pregnant woman. And Alice Neal, who lived to be 100, died earlier in this century. She painted a number of different times various women in her circle when they were pregnant. And as with the Eleanor Antin, just letting her body kind of show itself just like it is, the pregnant woman has been very, very seldom in Western art. It's been a really taboo kind of subject. And I'll have more to say about that in this companion lecture on feminist perspective. But for now, you can see this is so far, Margaret Evans pregnant from 78. You can see this is very far from the standard Venus-like image portrayed again and again in Western art. So now we get to our second segment here, bringing crafts back into high art. Because for centuries, really, the crafts, whether it was textile and fabric art, or whether it was metalwork or other types of crafts, they were given several steps down below the hierarchy. And there was definitely a hierarchy imposed all the way going back to Renaissance times, with painting and sculpture sort of duking it out at the top of the heap there. And there was even a whole controversy or argument going back and forth back in the day about which is superior, sculpture or painting. And Leonardo and Michelangelo faced off and arguing both sides. But what was agreed upon was that they were at the top of the pyramid, and then all the lesser arts were below that, including, of course, crafts. So it became a real project of many feminist artists to bring the crafts back into what we consider as serious art. And here we have Faith Ringgold once again, one of a whole series of story quilts that she created, and it's a little bit clipped off, but you can see along the top that this has a story too. And the whole point of the series was to reintroduce or reinsert women back into the sort of the patriarchal story or history of art. So here she's gathered together some of her ancestors here, all African-American women. And here they are quilting, a quilting bee going on here with sunflowers. The handmaiden or the hand gentleman to the right is Van Gogh. And of course, he, as you know, very famous for his sunflower paintings. But he's the kind of the lesser figure here, sort of in the background, bringing a bouquet of flowers to the quilting bee. And so Faith Ringgold did, as again I said, a whole series where she's reinserting women and women's art, and specifically craft art, back into the grand history of art. Now, Miriam Shapiro, you remember I've talked briefly about her when I introduced Woman House that she taught with Judy Chicago back at Cal Arts in the 70s. Miriam Shapiro, and you remember in her dollhouse, she was, you saw the little miniature painting of what she was working on at the time, very abstract and geometric shapes, painted. Well, after that, she developed a kind of a crossover kind of art, which was basically a collage technique, not unrelated to quilting, except it did not involve, it involves fabrics of many kinds, but did not involve sewing. So that's the difference here that you see in this, one of her many theater paintings. That also was a series of paintings. So this, if you were to see this up close and in detail, you would find that it's a hybrid of painted surfaces as well as collaged fabric of many different kinds and many different colors. And she insisted on calling them not collage, but she wanted to really emphasize that this was women's work. So she coined the term femage to refer in a general kind of way to the theater paintings as well as other work like the fan paintings that she was doing well into the 80s and 90s. And of course, we have our own Ruth Osawa. For those of you who live in the Bay Area, I'm sure that you are familiar with Ruth Osawa's beautiful work. There's a permanent display at the DeYoung Museum of her work, beautifully lit. And even though she was working in metal, there's something very sort of oriented towards textile arts. It looks almost like these beautiful airborne sculptures were knitted or crocheted. But they are in fact wire and brass and copper wire, very skillfully joined together and knitted together. So another direction that was taken that we can also talk about as reintroducing crafts into very serious and very provocative art. I'm showing you the work of Joyce Scott. And I first got to know Joyce probably back in the 1980s. She's a Baltimore artist. And of course, I was also in Maryland. And I got to know her and her work. And she was using textiles, but also very significantly beadwork, which is also associated with craft work. But she took it to a whole new level, a little bit like Faith Ringgold. She was using her beadwork to tell stories like Ringgold with her story quilts. And so you see a whole rape going on with this laid out woman, helpless, screaming, and her perpetrator here with bloody hands. And then this other figure, male presumably, reaching out to both the man and the woman. So she's telling a whole story. This is quite a fairly miniature piece. You can judge that by the size of these very tiny little beads. Very, very delicate work, which I think takes a lot of patience. And this is another work of Joyce Scott's on the right, also a kind of a horrific scene with this presumably female skeleton with the blonde hair being splayed apart as if she's giving birth. And so this is a combination of both textile arts, fabric and thread, as well as her signature beadwork. Some of you may know the work of Linda Benglis, who got her start in the late 1960s. She's still going strong. And this is a picture, this is a work that I picked up in an exhibition she had down in Palo Alto. Oh, I want to say 2018, maybe. Anyway, this is a work from 1968. And it's made up, first of all, of this fan-like shape made out of metal netting, very transparent and delicate. And of course, the shape of it is, as a fan, definitely evokes everything we can imagine about fans being associated with women, with flirtation, with the language of fans, the gestures associated with fans, particularly back in the 19th century. But she's appended to it all these different feathers and beads and different kinds of jewelry here and little beads hanging down here. And of course, the textile arts here, threads and so forth. So it's really a very luscious kind of piece. We'll have an opportunity to revisit Benglis in our other companion talk. And so remember this piece when we return in another lecture to Linda Benglis. Well, of course, we have to say that the queen, the queen of all feminist art in this period of the late 20th century was created by Judy Chicago and a team of some 400, mostly volunteers, called The Dinner Party, which was completed and first exhibited in 1979. Some of you may have seen The Dinner Party when it was first exhibited at SF MoMA, although it also had a world tour, taking it to many other places in the United States as well as around the world. In the last 10 years or so, it has now found a permanent home and has its own space at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And it was a very deliberate program of Judy Chicago and her team to use materials in creating the dinner party, not only the iconography and the imagery, but also all the different kinds of materials that were used to create the dinner party. And of course, the foundational concept was that women have spent their lives cooking and serving food to others, whether it's their children, their family, their male associates. But the dinner party proper, of course, is honoring women themselves rather than being the servants. And she set out to create a history of women, starting with mythological figures, and as it goes around the two other arms of this large triangle, in the medieval times, they become individual known people, not just mythological goddesses and so forth, until finally the very last plate that you see, you can see that it goes in this direction around the triangle, which itself is a female symbol. And the last plate being Virginia Woolf. Let's see a detail here. So this is the very beginning of the narrative sequence as one walks around the table. And it was her idea, as much as possible, to create not only an image of the plate itself that might in some way suggest the period or the era in which this woman flourished or actually lived, but also to with the materials of the place setting and the runner to use materials that were likely used in that period. So it starts out with a primordial goddess, which of course would be prehistory, with beads here in the form of shells and what looks to me like a deer skin, right? Fine. And then moving on to some of the other early goddesses, until finally we come around to the other side of the table and see Georgia O'Keeffe. And I made a mistake before. The last plate on the table is Georgia O'Keeffe, preceded by Virginia Woolf. And I want to point out that Georgia O'Keeffe was actually still living at the time that this was made and first exhibited. And that's another thorny story, because Georgia O'Keeffe had kind of off again, on again relationship with feminism and the whole idea of being a feminist artist. She sometimes would grudgingly acknowledge it, but more often sort of push it away. But that wouldn't stop Judy and her team from honoring Georgia O'Keeffe. And among other things to point out, this plate is the most solid and rises up the highest on the of any of the plates on the dinner party. And you can see all of this was hand stitchery um, to create a kind of fade, which was characteristic of many of her landscape paintings. And on the linen that that it makes up the runner here would of course be the same linen that she used to stretch and to make her own paintings. So there was a lot of research that went into each one of the place settings and the plates for the dinner party, which was intended not only to create something like a history of women, but also the history of the different art forms and art materials associated with women in each one of these periods. So now we come to our third segment here, resisting the status quo, also known as the patriarchy. And we come to the work of Barbara Kruger, who started out in life as a graphic designer. And you can see how that approach really shows up in her art. And you can probably get a sense of how large this is from the tiles on the slate tiles that you see at the bottom. In other words, this is not just a tiny little poster. This is larger than life. And so the message is very clear. And of course, it was an abortion poster and really pushing back against the anti-abortion crusade. Your body is a battleground. The Guerrilla Girls also really had a really very visible role, particularly in New York or New York City, although there were other groups, Guerrilla Girl groups that sprung up in a number of other cities in the United States. They were not making art per se, but they were very much a part of the art community. They were an anonymous group, deliberately so the individual members could not be picked off by and scorched by naysayers. In this particular poster, the Guerrilla Girls are reviewing the Whitney referring, of course, to the biannual extravaganza put on by the Whitney Museum in New York, which, and of course, the kind of review that this represented was pointing out the disparity between the representation of women as opposed to men. So they started their work in 1987, postering all over downtown in Soho in New York. But this is from 1987, just a couple of years later. And I have to say, they've been very successful. They are still going strong. I saw a webinar just months ago where they were interviewed by people in the education department at SF MoMA and with their gorilla masks on, to not only to obviously reflect the name of the group, but also to keep it anonymous. And each one of the Guerrilla Girls takes a name of a dead woman artist. So one Guerrilla Girl will be Frida Kahlo, and another Guerrilla Girl will take the name of Sofonisba Anguissola, who was a 16th century Italian artist. And here's another well reproduced poster from the Guerrilla Girls. And what they've done is taken a reproduction of a very famous painting in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the painting of an odalisque by Ingres, and put their trademarks, gorilla masks on the top. So do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? And then they propose the statistics. And I should say that all of their posters, and they even have written books, and you can see, and you can check them out on their website. Their facts that they present are always well researched, and they in the small print, they indicate where the source for their information. So less than 3% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, 3%, but 83% of the nudes in all of the Metropolitan collections are female. So you can really see what they're doing with the disparity. In more recent years, I would like to point out, the Guerrilla Girls have really included or expanded out their focus not only on disparities in the representation of women, but also people of color and other kinds of disparities and distributions in not only in the art world, but beyond as well. Well, this was something of a shocker when Judith Bernstein started exhibiting these amazing charcoal drawings. That's the medium here. And this is certainly getting back at the patriarchy, as it were. And it's important to point out that these are very large paintings, or not, excuse me, drawings, because they're done all in charcoal. So it has that, when you see them for real, they have a very soft, velvety kind of depth to them. So imagine yourself standing in front of this, where it's about 7 feet tall and probably about 12, 13 feet long. I mean, they are huge. And it's part of a series, which and it caused quite an uproar, especially among male artists and male critics, because they're not used to having representations or suggestions, however metaphorical, of their private parts. They get away with a lot of the private parts of women, but to have images that might associate with male private parts, that was a big taboo, at least back in the 70s when she first started exhibiting these. So our last segment here is some of the ways in which we collectively are rewriting or taking back the history of art, how it's written, how it's presented, how it's taught. And I'm showing you here Cindy Sherman, who's a very high profile artist who uses herself as her own model almost exclusively. And so one way in which, in this particular pairing here, all of her works are always untitled, so you have to figure it out for yourself. But she's giving us a big hint that she is doing a revisionist history after Ingres, with the Ingres that you see on the right, the same artist who did the odalisque we saw a few slides ago, associated with the Metropolitan Museum Guerrilla Girls poster. And so she has changed the all so beautifully put together woman here as this kind of slovenly woman who's just barely woken up or something. She looks like maybe like a lady of the night, we might say politely. And she's also done other images. And remember, this is always herself that we see transformed with makeup and prosthetic devices and so forth in some cases. She is always presenting sometimes even outrageous ways in which women have been massacred, raped. But I'm showing you one of the more polite images of Cindy Sherman. And of course, as I pointed out before, when we saw this quilting bee at Arles, it's one of the ongoing projects of Faith Ringgold to rewrite history so that women have an equal place in the telling of art history. So since I'm just referencing it briefly here, bring it back into our rewriting of art history. And of course, Judy Chicago is part of this ongoing project, which is still very active, of rewriting a history which is more inclusive. And I should say that this is the larger project has really been taken up in the last, say, 2 decades very seriously by so many of our art institutions, including museums and art galleries and all sorts of publications. And I want to point particularly to Artemisia Gentileschi, who was one of the painters represented on the dinner party. She would be in the second of the 3 sides of the triangle. And she was a 17th century painter. And until I would say the 70s, she had a very, very minor part in the traditional history of art, story of art kinds of narratives. But through assiduous research of many feminist art scholars, she's really come into the limelight and appreciated, not because she's a woman artist, but because she's a really powerful, strong artist who can hold her own with the best. And in fact, at the in London right now, there is a major one artist retrospective solo exhibition of Gentileschi's art, which brings together her canvases from at least 10 different countries. I mean, it was a really effort. So that's just to suggest that she's really come into her own in recent years, and thanks largely to the research of many feminist scholars, as well as the giving a proper place for Artemisia at the dinner party. And finally, just a little shout out to our grandmothers. This is a very strange and wonderful object that was created in the Surrealist period in Paris by Merit Oppenheim. She called it what it is, a fur-lined teacup, done in 1936. She hung out with other surrealist artists like Man Ray and Ernst, and also the leaders of the French surrealist movement. And so she put together this wonderful little object. And the story that I wanted to share with you is another kind of story of how women have been written right out of history. I remember a certain moment back in probably the early 1970s. I was, of course, familiar with Merit Oppenheim's work. And I was teaching a big survey class at the University of Maryland on 20th century art. And it was my student assistant who brought it to my attention in the textbook I was using, which I have to confess I had not read carefully, was referring to Merit Oppenheim as a man. Of course, anything that was as celebrated as this object, which was reproduced everywhere as the iconic sort of strange, wonderful, surrealist object. Of course, that very well-known object had to be by a man. It would not cross anybody's mind that it would be by a woman. Well, that started a whole train of thought in my own mind. And I then subsequently did research, wrote an article for Art News, or Arts Magazine, and also finally met Merit Oppenheim, who was living in Bern, Switzerland at the time. And as I was going about my research, um, I'd meet up with colleagues at conferences and so forth, and we always sort of sniff each other out. What are you working on? What's your research like? And I would say, oh, well, I'm working on Merit Oppenheim. She created the Furlan teacup. Well, having said that, this was my main research, I would often get corrected. And, oh, no, 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 that Furlan teacup was not made by a woman. It was made by Man Ray. That was one choice. Or they would correct me by saying, oh no, that was by Marcel Duchamp. So that gives you just a little sense of how ingrained this writing women right out of history was at that time. And it probably still shows up at various times still, although we've come a long way since then. One of our other grandmothers, of course, is Georgia O'Keeffe. I mentioned earlier in looking at the dinner party that she was hailed as a feminist artist, creating works that were showed a woman's point of view, and yet she kind of hesitated and was not happy with that designation. But that did not stop Judy Chicago and many, many other artists from really seeing her as painting the female experience. And we come back to some of the images that we've seen, the sort of center core images. This is one of two out of a series. Number one on the left, which is more conventional, a little closer to what a Jack in the Pulpit looks like, and then much more abstracted and much more similar really to Judy Chicago's Through the Flower, which I showed you earlier. And another one of our grandmothers, of course, is Frida Kahlo, the two Fridas. This is a double self-portrait done in 1939. And she has, in recent years, become something of a widespread icon, not just of the feminist movement, but really of the culture at large, where she is really showing herself in at least two of her personas. From the tradition of European art represented by this Victorian looking woman on the left, and then the image of her on the right showing her as a lover of Mexican culture, indigenous culture in the Tijuana dress. And one of her very well-known self-portraits, of which there are many, her Broken Column, where she really puts it out there, her own bodily suffering. Because many of you may know that she had a lot of unfortunate accidents and other health problems throughout her life, which did not stop her from continuing her painting. And so she's representing herself here because she did in fact have serious back problems, the broken column, and had to wear all kinds of prosthetic devices, including this strap-like gear that she had to wear just to keep her body aligned. And then the nails that are very often used in Christian iconography to represent pain, a very visible sense of pain, that she carried with her for most of her life. And I end with Louise Bourgeois, who died only recently and well up in her 80s. She could have even been in her early 90s. Very vigorous, very active to the very end. A self-portrait, really a body portrait, showing, as Carolee Schneemann did in a very different kind of way, showing the source of her own self and creativity of these pod-like and a sort of a kind of a body, and all these pods representing fertility. And we might read these as little breasts. And what I find particularly hilarious in this other image on the right, this fillette, which of course means little girl, she's really getting both the sexes in there with this emerging penis at the top. Presumably, what I make up is that little girls already having dreams and of sexual intercourse. And then down below, much more representation of the female genitalia. So we can read it as both and. And I end with her success in later years of having this fabulous show at the Guggenheim in New York, which took place in 2008, which she did live to see. The whole museum was given over to her, a retrospective of her work, including one of a series that she did of these really quite scary spiders. And a couple of years ago, there was a whole exhibition just of her spiders at the Guggenheim, at SF MoMA in San Francisco. So I hope this has given you a little taste of what feminist art can look like. You can see that there's no one look, just like Lucy Lippard pointed out in one of the beginning slides I showed you, that it can take many different forms. So I hope that you've learned something. I've enjoyed sharing some of my knowledge with you.